Hey, everybody. Welcome to our second episode of the Industrial Strength Podcast, a podcast more focused on industrial fire departments and industrial hazmat response. Once again, my name is Randy, and I'm a hazmat specialist with 17 years on an industrial fire department doing hazmat. And with me, once again, are my co-hosts, Jeff and Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve, hazmat technician with about 3 years of experience in hazmat and emergency response and about 10 years in an industrial setting.
And I'm Jeff. I'm a hazmat wizard or technician. I have over 20 years in the fire service, with about 10 being in the industrial side of hazmat part of it.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. So for everyone, in this podcast, this specific episode, we're going to talk about a call where we had an employee who was working on the cleanup of a piece of equipment and became overcome by solvent vapors.
That's right. The employee had noticed a solvent leak on his equipment, and during the cleanup, he attempted to correct the problem. In order to fix this problem, the employee went into the pit area underneath the equipment to try and stop the leak and was overcome by solvent vapors. A lot like happens to you on a nice hot summer day when you're trapped inside a vehicle and your buddy lets one rip after a nice pot of spicy chili.
Yeah, that overcomes anybody in that vehicle.
Yeah. So the solvent had been leaking out of a poorly sealed equipment, and it had been running to a nearby floor drain. Thankfully, the sewer system is environmentally monitored, so it really caught the leak and gave out a general notice to our production. They needed to check for their leaks. So from that notice is really how the employees realized that the equipment was leaking in the first place.
Right, yeah. Before we get too far, I think the listeners will need some important background information. So for starters, the solvent we'll be talking about in this episode is dichloromethane, also commonly called methylene chloride.
Methylene chloride is a volatile organic compound, which means it has a high vapor pressure. Things with high vapor pressures tend to evaporate quickly and turn into a gas very easily, just like a case of beer does on a hot summer day out on the lake with all your buddies.
Yeah, it disappears real quick.
So while the effectiveness is used in many different applications and it's well known, it does pose some health risks to workers if it's inhaled or really absorbed through the skin. One of the important things to remember about methylene chloride, especially in this incident, is that the molecule is heavier than air. So it's going to find the lowest spots and it's going to settle down in there. And, especially in containers and pits, especially in this case. And it's going to fill up from the bottom up.
Right, yeah. Hey, Steve, do you happen to know what we use methylene, or what methylene chloride is typically used for in industry?
Well, it typically is used for paint stripping, degreasing, and as a solvent in chemical production. But one typical use that not many people know about is it's actually used in all those decaffeinated drinks you like. So those yummy decaf coffees and teas.
Right, yeah, they use methylene chloride to strip that caffeine right out of the beans and stuff before it's processed. Yeah.
That's a waste.
It is. Let it all the way, baby.
That's right. So methylene chloride, let's talk about those the vapors off it. So methylene chloride vapors are clear and colorless, so you're not going to really see them. Unlike other things that do happen to have color, like iodines, some nitrogen compounds, but it's definitely not odorless. So methylene chloride has been described as having a sweet aroma like chloroform or an ether, and can be detected by the nose at levels around 160 parts per million. And so,
now, Randy,
yeah.
I just got to know, how do you know what chloroform smells like? Have you been having some parties again, trying to meet some new friends?
I may allegedly have some in my lab. We're all friends. but honestly, no, it's a common laboratory solvent. So a lot of times it's used in industrial analytical chemistry. But so going back a little bit, once again, you can detect it by nose by like 160 parts per million. And the danger level that we're really concerned about for methylene chloride is 2,300 parts per million, much higher than that detectable level by nose. And one last bit of important trivia is that methylene chloride can be considered flammable, but not by traditional methods. So methylene chloride doesn't have a listed flash point, which is unusual for something considered flammable. And that goes back to how that testing is done. Typically, when you do testing on a flammable solvent, you kind of put it in a cup, and then you put a lid on it, you introduce a spark, and depending on what temperature is when it catches is how you determine flash point. With methylene chloride, they couldn't come up with a flash point, but what they did find in other testing was that when you do mix warm methylene chloride, and by warm I mean like 100 degrees C, with oxygen, it then starts to make flammable mixtures in the air. But it isn't until about that point that you get those flammable mixtures, which is why it can be a flammable vapor with no flash point.
Thanks, Randy. Let's go back to our call here. So the employee who initially went to fix the leak was found unconscious in the pit, and he was under the equipment, and their body pretty much slumped over the equipment. It was really unknown how long he had been down there. What was the time? Whenever he went down to fix that leak.
Right. Yeah, and that's an important issue, right? Because if you don't know how long he's down, it might be a critical action situation, right? And time is of the essence for those kind of things.
Yeah. And for whatever reason, the employee did make the decision to enter that pit knowing that it was a confined space and also knowing that there was a leak. I think we have a sign or a picture of that pit. That's the one.
Yeah,
so as you can see,
clearly identified.
Even for a third grader, they would understand something's going on here, not to enter the area. You would hope. But a lot of them are like me. They see a sign that tells them not to do something. Gotta try it.
Yeah. Well, it's either that or it's one of those things where you've seen that sign 100 times and you start ignoring it a little bit, right? You get a little blind to it.
That's right. Now, if we can pull that map up, we can show a little bit better description here. So in this instance, the X represents the colleague who went down and was overcome by solvent vapors, initially trying to remediate that leak during the cleanup. Additionally, there was a second worker who was found the unconscious person and called the industrial fire department in. And while they were waiting on our arrival, they then attempted to render aid to the first colleague by pulling them out of the pit to safety. That second colleague was also overcome by solvent fumes, rendering him unconscious.
Right.
Now, the uniqueness to this scenario is actually the equipment pit is kind of in a intermediate space between the first level and a basement. Isn't that right, Randy? Yeah,
that's right. It's definitely a weird space where it exists between two floors. I think we've talked about this before at our facility. We tend to call it like a half deck or half floor. And so the two staircases you see in this map, there's a staircase down from first floor into this pit space. And then there's also a staircase up from what would be the basement into this pit space. So while the first employee, who we have labeled as X, went down the stairs into this pit space and became overcome, that second person who tried to rescue him kind of came up the stairs from the basement to get into that pit, and they realized that they were being overcome by something quickly. But once again, it's kind of easy to understand why after the fact, right? It's all, 2020 hindsight, because as Jeff said earlier, those DCM vapors are heavy, right? They're low to the ground. And so if you're coming up to this pit space, you got to imagine that the entire bottom of this pit is filled with these vapors. So once that victim realized he was becoming overcome, guy Y, I think he stumbled through a doorway, back down those stairs. Luckily, I don't know how he made him down those stairs, and out the second door before he passed out into the basement. So, one guy was still in the pit, and then guy Y was in the basement, past two doors and past the staircase.
Yeah, when our first responders arrived, they were able to quickly locate the employee in the pit and perform a line-of-sight rescue, bringing him out of that pit. The second employee regained consciousness and was able to self-extricate himself out of that area.
Which is actually a really good thing, because when we responded to the call, the page out was actually for a man down, not multiple men down or multiple issues in the area. So we didn't even have a clue that second colleague had went down there.
You're right. It wasn't until after the fact, once again, hindsight, right, that he came to us. So it was lucky that he was able to stumble out as far as he did. The fact that it made almost like an air brake with those two doors so that he wasn't continuously overcome.
Yep. Now, a little bit more on some side effects of the chloride is the inhalation of methylene chloride vapors can cause anesthetic effects on people, impairing central nervous system function, and even giving a person an outward appearance of drunkenness. A lot like that colleague I think we all have coming back from a Friday afternoon lunch.
Or maybe the chloroform, right?
Yeah. Now, as we stated earlier, chloride vapors are heavier than air and will displace oxygen from the bottom up. This is also the same case in the lungs.
Yeah.
So after being pulled from the pit, our employee was in really, really rough shape. After a quick gross decon and a medical evaluation, he was found to not be breathing at all. He wasn't even responding to a sternal rub. So after a few tense moments, as you can imagine, a few medical interventions and some positive pressure breathing for him, the employee started coming back around, and after a few more minutes after that, still on oxygen, the same employee did regain consciousness, fortunately.
Yeah, I think the whole reason that happened was with those positive pressure ventilations, we were able to displace the methylene chloride vapors and actually reintroduce oxygen. Once again, hindsight, right?
That's right. Now, when Jeff talks about some sternal rubs and not responding to that pain stimuli, I can speak to it. Randy was giving him a good hard rub.
Yeah.
Nobody would have been comfortable with that and would have came to.
Yeah, no, it was one of those things where I wanted to see if he had a response, and there was nobody home. It was, once again, kind of very disturbing from a first responder perspective.
Yep.
Yeah, sure.
Now, the second employee had also lost consciousness and underwent medical evaluation, where he was actually found to have had labored breathing, but otherwise he was unremarkable. So
yeah, I'm pretty sure it's one of those things. The labored breathing is probably also he still had methylene chloride vapor in his lungs. It hadn't processed through yet, and because he was upright, it was harder for him to get it out.
Yep. Now, in this instance, we sent both employees to get some supplemental oxygen and then sent them by ambulance to hospital to get full evaluation because they were at a point that we just couldn't do any more for them than giving them oxygen.
Right, yeah. So after that, what happened was the hazmat team got called in at this time. So first we did our pick and pull line of sight rescue, did medical, and then it became time for the hazmat team to come on scene. And so the hazmat team got called in, and we were tasked with trying to determine the pit area was still of concern to anyone else in the building. At that time, we knew the chemical concern was methylene chloride and that the leak had stopped. We couldn't see it leaking anymore. So a little background information. At the time of this incident, it was near the end of second shift. While it was colder outside, because I think it was like late spring, the interior of the building was temperature controlled at 70. And the goal was for us to try and use meters to determine if the pit area was still oxygen deficient and how much residual methylene chloride vapors we had present.
Yeah, sure. Because, we were checking for the gases and not performing a plumbing repair, the team decided that level B suits probably wasn't needed. Because methylene chloride can be potentially flammable issue, we decided the best course of action would be our bunker gear. Yeah. And, obviously an SCBA.
Yeah, right, because of that respiratory issue, right? We had two guys go down. We don't know what that environment is.
Yeah. And, as far as the meters go, we decided on two different meters. We used our 4-gas and our Draeger CMS. The 4-gas meter does check for LEO and the oxygen percentage, while that Draeger CMS, it does provide more of a detailed parts per million to a specific target.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump in for a quick second. I don't know how many people are familiar with Draeger CMS as a product, right? So this is something that our team uses Draeger. We have multiple different Draeger products. If you're not familiar with the Draeger CMS, I'm sure everyone is familiar with Draeger tubes, right? Draeger tubes are as old as the hills. Everyone still uses them. They're still pretty valid. They can be a very integral part of a team. The CMS was an attempt to kind of update it. So what happens is you have like a Draeger tube is considered one test. The Draeger CMS is a chip that's got 10 tests on it. And you feed it into a handheld meter, and it would run almost the exact same test as you would out of a tube, except there's no cutting of glass tubes anymore with the CMS system. It's nice from that fact, so you don't have to worry about punctures in your glove and such. The downside is the CMS could be a finicky piece of equipment to use, right? Sometimes you try to feed in the chip and it didn't like it. Sometimes the chip got stuck. Sometimes the chip didn't want to come out. And then even when you fed it in right and it read the chip and you went to go hit the test, it errored out on you and you had to do it all over again. But for us, we were able to take that CMS system and run it downrange and use it on this call.
That's right. And I got to be honest, even though we still have those little glitchy issues with it, I still prefer it over getting all the way downrange in a level A suit and then trying to remember, all right, how many times do I have to pump this little tube for this specific chemical? Yeah. You know, I can only fit so much stuff in this brain, and that tends to go out the window pretty quick.
Right, yeah, you're focused on the job, not on the metrics. So it's an easy thing to forget.
So in this call, the results from that reconnaissance sweep actually did not find an LEL environment in the pit area and had no reflection in the O2 readings using the 4-gas meter. The Draeger CMS was actually placed on the floor near where the leaking chute cone had potentially been leaking, as this had been the case many times before, and it was a known issue that we kind of figured this is probably the most likely source. So we placed that there and got a positive hit for that of 229 parts per million. Now, the 8-hour TWA is 100 parts per million with 500 parts per million short-term exposure limit for chloride.
Yeah.
During that recon, the team actually discovered that the pit area was equipped with 2 portable alarming oxygen sensors as well, but these sensors were found to be inoperable at the time. So with that being said, we decided to use forced air ventilation and eventually lower the remaining methylene chloride levels down to 0 so that we could turn the area back over to production.
Right, yeah. And in our previous episodes, we touched on engineering safety controls. Because once again, like I said in the previous episode, it's a big part of what we do at our facility. But there were engineering controls that were supposed to help mitigate issues, but they were found to be ineffective. And in this call, we had similar failures in engineering controls, which led to some pretty serious consequences for one of our colleagues.
Yeah, first and foremost, the pit in question had been assessed, and it was assessed to be a confined space. That confined space was adequately marked with signs that we have already seen, and they're meant to deter potential spur-of-the-moment entries when there are severe conditions. Mm-hmm. And again, for whatever reason, that employee did decide to enter that pit. Still unknown as to why he did that. Complacency.
Right, or maybe it was just one of those things where they knew it was going to be an environmental concern with that leaking chloride to the sewer, and he just wanted to get that stopped, right? But still not a clear answer as to why, even to this day.
Yep. Now, another failure in the engineering controls for this scenario was the inoperable low oxygen alarms. After that call, the portable oxygen alarms were actually collected and inspected. It was determined that these were failed due to just age, which is kind of alarming considering that typically you can usually get about 2 years out of these sensors unless you're in a saturated area and getting exposed repeatedly.
Was that an intentional pun, Steve? It was an alarming thing.
Maybe.
You're right. So I don't know how many people outside of hazmat technicians might know that an oxygen sensor or any sensor's lifetime is kind of pegged to 2 years under ideal conditions. Sometimes you can get more, but you can definitely get less depending on severity of the environment that they're in and other things, right? So I think that this operator who was working in the area, he had no idea what the life expectancy of those sensors are. It's not something that's part of that learning curriculum for them, whereas it's definitely something more along lines of that for us as technicians.
That's right. And furthermore, it was also discovered that these particular monitors and alarms were never put in any type of a preventative maintenance program, which typically would take place about every 3 to 6 months on these monitors and help make sure that they're in prime operating condition so that we can actually pay attention and know what alarms we're going to get. Right, but these just never were, and they were installed right off the shop floor.
Yeah, so I think that was a big critical miss, right? So if that had been installed, it may have alarmed to let them know there's oxygen deficiency, and they may not have gone down in that pit, and it may have been one of those things that could have made a decisive difference for that employee. But one of the other things I do want to touch on, one thing that our department doesn't do that maybe a lot of outside departments do is that our department's never issued commendations. No commendations for service, bravery, valor. The only thing we kind of really do recognize on our department is years of service, which, don't get me wrong, I'm very grateful that they do that. But to me, I think that when our team arrived as quickly as it did, recognized the distress that this person in the pit was in, and then did an immediate line of sight pick and pull on them, I think that they saved this guy's life. And to be honest, I think that should have garnered a commendation for bravery or valor. But that's my opinion. And once again, it's just one of those things where, as an industrial department, we just don't do that, and maybe we should. So, but what do you guys think, right? So what's the general consensus? Do you think that this is like just part of the job and what you should be doing? Or do you think this raises to the line of should have garnered a commendation, even like a life-saving pin or something? So what do the listeners think, right? How about you guys? How about you weigh in and let us know maybe what your departments do, right? Is this something that your department does? Do they issue commendations and awards? Do they do life-saving, valor, bravery, stork pins? I mean, pull out all the cards for people from municipal departments to industrial. What does your industrial department do as far as awards and commendations? Would this merit? Would it not?
Sure.
No, I definitely think this one should have merited some sort of an award just for the expediency in which we had members do that line of sight rescue. They made a split-second decision, and they got down there, and it made a big difference on the type of call that we had to make home to the family members. Agreed,
right? Absolutely. It was a rescue and not a recovery. It was a great call for us.
Yep. Now, for you listeners out there, we've told you about the monitors and meters that we used on this particular call, but what might you have used off your truck that's different from ours that maybe you have and we don't? Might have made this call a little bit easier and more efficient for us.
Yeah, has your department had similar calls? Let us know. Reach out to us. Share your thoughts, experiences. You can contact us at hazmatharder@gmail.com.
Yep, that's right. And for all you out there, our next episode is going to be an intriguing one. In our industry, we call this type of an incident a high energy release. Now, for you that don't understand what that means out there, that means things that go boom.
Right.
Just think on that one.
Yeah, it's going to be an exciting call for sure. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Remember to hazmat harder.